My morning systolic blood pressure dropped from 147 mmHg trying to 118 mmHg tries over 11 weeks without changing my medication, eliminating sodium, or adding a single pharmaceutical intervention. My resting heart rate declined from 74 to 63 beats per minute. My nighttime cortisol, measured via salivary assay, fell by 38%. And the intervention that drove nearly all of these changes was something most cardiologists never ask their patients about: the lighting environment inside their home. I am a professor of cardiovascular and metabolic physiology at a research university, and I have spent 2 decades studying the non-pharmacological determinants of blood pressure regulation. What I discovered, first in the literature and then in my own biology, is that the artificial light spectrum most households bathe themselves in every evening is producing a sustained, measurable disruption to the hormonal and autonomic systems that govern blood pressure. This is not a fringe hypothesis. The mechanistic pathways are well characterized, the clinical associations are replicated, and the intervention is straightforward. Yet, it remains almost entirely absent from standard hypertension counseling. Today, I am sharing the exact mechanisms by which household lighting raises morning blood pressure, the precise physiological pathways involved, and the protocol I implemented to correct it. I will be specific about what to change, when, and why each element matters at the molecular level. Mechanism. Number 1. The circadian clock and its command over blood pressure. To understand why light matters for blood pressure, you must first understand that blood pressure is not a static value your body passively maintains. It is a tightly orchestrated, time-dependent variable governed by the circadian clock, an internal biological timing system synchronized primarily by light signals received through the eyes. The master circadian clock resides in the suprachiasmatic nucleus, or SCN, a paired structure of approximately 20,000 neurons in the anterior hypothalamus. The SCN receives direct photic input via the retinohypothalamic tract, a dedicated neural pathway from intrinsically photosensitive retinal ganglion cells, or iPRGCs, that contain the photopigment melanopsin. This system is maximally sensitive to short wavelength light in the 460 to 480 nanometer range, the precise range dominated by LED and fluorescent sources that now illuminate the overwhelming majority of modern homes. The SCN drives circadian rhythmicity throughout the body by synchronizing peripheral clocks in virtually every organ system, including the vascular endothelium, the adrenal cortex, the kidneys, and the autonomic ganglia that regulate vascular tone. Under normal conditions, this system produces a predictable blood pressure profile, a nocturnal dip of 10 to 20% during sleep, followed by a controlled morning rise, the morning surge, that prepares the cardiovascular system for waking activity. Research published in Hypertension and the Journal of the American Heart Association has established that individuals whose circadian blood pressure rhythm is disrupted, specifically those who fail to exhibit the normal nocturnal dip, carry dramatically elevated risk for cardiovascular events, independent of their mean 24-hour blood pressure. Non-dipping and reverse dipping patterns are associated with left ventricular hypertrophy, increased stroke incidence, and accelerated renal damage. The circadian system does not merely modulate blood pressure slightly. It is the primary architect of the diurnal pressure profile. When artificial light, particularly blue spectrum light, is delivered to the eye during the hours the SCN expects darkness, the downstream consequence is a blunted or absent nocturnal dip, an elevated morning cortisol surge, and dysregulated sympathetic activation at precisely the time when the cardiovascular system is most vulnerable. My own ambulatory blood pressure monitoring, conducted over 14 days before I modified my lighting environment, confirmed a non-dipping pattern. My nocturnal mean was 131/82, nearly identical to my daytime mean. Following the protocol I will describe, my nocturnal mean fell to 108/67, restoring a normal dipping architecture and reducing the amplitude of my morning surge substantially. Mechanism, 2, melanopsin, melatonin suppression, and vascular consequences. The mechanism connecting evening light exposure to morning blood pressure elevation proceeds through one of the most well-studied hormonal pathways in chronobiology, the suppression of melatonin by light-activated melanopsin signaling, melanopsin-containing iPRGC's project through the retinohypothalamic tract to the SCN. When these cells are activated, which occurs with high efficiency in the presence of blue wavelength light, even at relatively low luminance levels, the SCN transmits inhibitory signals, ultimately suppressing norepinephrine release onto the pineal gland and blocking melatonin synthesis. Melatonin is not merely a sleep signal. It is a direct vasoactive compound. Research from the Journal of Hypertension and Cardiovascular Research has characterized melatonin receptors, specifically MT1 and MT2 subtypes, on vascular smooth muscle cells and endothelial cells. MT1 receptor activation mediates vasoconstriction, while MT2 receptor activation, which predominates during the nocturnal surge of melatonin under normal conditions, promotes vasodilation and contributes to the nocturnal blood pressure dip. Suppression of the nocturnal melatonin surge by evening blue light, therefore, removes a key vasodilatory signal from the peripheral vasculature precisely when the cardiovascular system requires it. The vascular smooth muscle, deprived of MT2-mediated relaxation, maintains elevated tone through the night. The renin-angiotensin-aldosterone system remains more active than it should be in the overnight period, and sodium retention increases marginally but measurably. And when the morning cortisol surge arrives, itself amplified by disrupted circadian architecture, it lands on a vascular bed that never fully relaxed, producing an exaggerated morning pressure spike. A 2019 study published in the European Heart Journal demonstrated that evening exposure to room-intensity white light, containing a substantial blue component, was sufficient to suppress melatonin by more than 70% in healthy adults and produce immeasurable blunting of the nocturnal blood pressure dip. The light levels involved were entirely typical of ordinary household lighting: overhead LED fixtures, television screens, and ambient room illumination. No extreme exposure was required to produce clinically meaningful physiological disruption. Mechanism, Zucker 3. Cortisol dysregulation and the amplified morning surge. The hypothalamic pituitary adrenal axis, the HPA axis, is one of the most robustly circadian regulated systems in the body. Under normal conditions, cortisol secretion from the adrenal cortex follows a precise diurnal pattern. A steep rise beginning approximately 30 to 45 minutes before habitual wake time, peaking within the first hour of waking in what is termed the cortisol awakening response, and declining steadily across the day to a nadir in the late evening and early nighttime hours. This cortisol awakening response is not incidental. It is the primary physiological mechanism by which the cardiovascular system prepares itself for the demands of waking life. Cortisol activates glucocorticoid receptors on vascular smooth muscle cells, upregulates adrenergic receptor expression, sensitizes the vasculature to catecholamines, and, through its effects on the renin-angiotensin system, increases sodium retention and plasma volume. In appropriate, well-timed magnitude, this response is necessary and adaptive. When it is dysregulated in amplitude or timing, it becomes the single largest driver of exaggerated morning hypertension. The circadian regulation of the HPA axis depends critically on accurate light entrainment of the SCN. When evening light exposure delays or disrupts SCN signaling, the timing of the cortisol nadir shifts later into the night. The depth of the trough decreases, and the amplitude of the morning cortisol awakening response increases compensatorily. Research from the journal Psychoneuroendocrinology has demonstrated that individuals with chronically disrupted circadian light environments show cortisol, nadir values 25 to 40% higher than controls, meaning they never achieve the degree of HPA suppression the body requires overnight. The cardiovascular consequence of this HPA dysregulation is direct and measurable. Elevated nighttime cortisol maintains sympathetic nervous system activation, prevents complete vascular relaxation, and potentiates the renin-angiotensin-aldosterone response. When the morning cortisol surge then occurs on top of this already elevated baseline, the resulting vasopressor effect is amplified significantly. Systolic blood pressure in the first 2 hours after waking can exceed the 24-hour mean by 20 to 30 millimoles charge in individuals with this pattern, a phenomenon that strongly predicts adverse cardiovascular events. My salivary cortisol profiling, conducted at 6 time points across the day, confirmed this exact pattern before intervention. A nadir value of 4.2 nanograms per milliliter at 2x a.m., markedly elevated compared to population norms. After 8 weeks of the lighting protocol, my nadir had fallen to 1.8, and my morning awakening response, while still appropriately robust, was no longer producing the exaggerated early morning pressure overshoot I had documented previously. Mechanism therefore, sympathetic nervous system activation by blue light, beyond the hormonal pathways. Blue spectrum light exerts direct effects on autonomic nervous system tone through SCN-driven modulation of sympathetic outflow. This mechanism operates on a faster time scale than the cortisol and melatonin pathways, and contributes to acute elevations in blood pressure during and immediately after evening light exposure. The SCN projects to the paraventricular nucleus of the hypothalamus, which in turn influences the rostral ventrolateral medulla, the primary brainstem nucleus responsible for setting sympathetic vasomotor tone. Under conditions of appropriate circadian entrainment, SCN activity during the biological night suppresses sympathetic outflow, allowing heart rate variability to increase, peripheral vascular resistance to decline, and the nocturnal blood pressure dip to occur. Blue spectrum light stimulation of IPRGCs during the evening disrupts the sequence by generating aberrant daytime signals within the SCN during what should be the biological night. The rostral ventrolateral medulla receives inappropriately elevated activating input, sympathetic tone is maintained or increased, vascular resistance remains elevated, and the nocturnal dip is attenuated or eliminated. Research using heart rate variability analysis, a validated index of autonomic balance, has consistently demonstrated that evening exposure to blue-enriched light shifts the autonomic balance towards sympathetic dominance and reduces high-frequency HRV components reflecting parasympathetic activity. A study in the Journal of Clinical Hypertension found that hypertensive patients had significantly lower nocturnal HRV and a significantly higher LF to HF ratio, indicating sympathetic predominance when assessed on evenings with standard household light exposure compared to evenings with amber filtered or minimized light. The practical consequence is that the autonomic nervous system never fully transitions into the parasympathetic dominant state that healthy nocturnal blood pressure regulation requires. The heart rate does not slow as much as it should. Peripheral resistance does not decline as much as it should. And the vascular beds do not vasodilate as completely as they should. The cumulative result is a higher pressure platform from which the morning surge then departs. Mechanism. Number 5. Endothelial dysfunction and nitric oxide. The downstream consequence. The mechanisms described above, melatonin suppression, cortisol dysregulation, and sympathetic overactivation, do not operate in isolation. Over time, their combined effect on the vascular endothelium compounds the blood pressure problem. Through a separate and self-reinforcing pathway, endothelial dysfunction and impaired nitric oxide bioavailability. The vascular endothelium, the single-cell thick lining of every blood vessel, is the primary source of nitric oxide production. Nitric oxide, synthesized from L-arginine, is the most potent endogenous vasodilator known, and its continuous basal production is essential for maintaining normal resting vascular tone and blood pressure. Endothelial nitric oxide production is exquisitely sensitive to oxidative stress. Superoxide anion reacts with nitric oxide at near-diffusion limited rates to form peroxynitrite, simultaneously inactivating the vasodilator and generating a highly reactive oxidant that damages the endothelium further. Chronically elevated cortisol and sustained sympathetic activation, both consequences of disrupted circadian light signaling, increase vascular oxidative stress through multiple mechanisms. The cumulative result of months to years of evening light-driven circadian disruption is a measurable reduction in endothelium-dependent vasodilation. Flow-mediated dilation studies in shift workers, perhaps the most extreme natural model of circadian disruption, consistently demonstrate impaired endothelial function compared to day workers. And this impairment partially explains the elevated cardiovascular risk in that population. My own endothelial assessment, measured via peripheral arterial tonometry before and after the lighting intervention, showed an improvement in the reactive hyperemia index from 1.67 to 214 over 11 weeks, a meaningful improvement in endothelial vasodilatory capacity that paralleled the blood pressure reduction. The household lighting problem in specific terms. Having established the mechanisms, I want to be precise about what specifically constitutes the dangerous household lighting pattern, because the problem is not light per se, but light of particular spectral composition delivered at the wrong biological time. Standard LED bulbs, which now dominate residential lighting globally, emit a spectrum that includes a prominent peak in the 450 to 470 nanometer blue range. This peak arises from the blue LED semiconductor that excites the phosphor coating in white LEDs. Even bulbs marketed as warm white retain a meaningful blue component. Typical household illumination in the evening deliver between 100 and 500 lux to the eye. Research from Harvard Medical School has established that light levels as low as 8 lux at the cornea are sufficient to produce measurable melatonin suppression when the spectrum is blue enriched. Standard household lighting, particularly from overhead LED sources, delivers illuminance levels that are many times the threshold for maximum melanopsin activation. Television and screen devices compound the problem. A standard television viewed from a typical distance delivers 50 to 150 lux directly to the eye, from a source that is almost entirely in the blue-enriched spectrum. Smartphones and tablets held at close range deliver 50 to 400 lux. The aggregated blue light exposure from a typical evening represents a sustained, high-intensity circadian disruption signal that is without precedent in evolutionary history. The critical window during which this exposure causes the greatest circadian disruption is the 2 to 3 hours before habitual sleep time. Research from the journal Current Biology demonstrated that shifting light exposure away from this window, even without reducing total light exposure across the day, substantially restored melatonin profiles and improved the nocturnal blood pressure dip. My complete protocol, implementing the lighting correction. The protocol I implemented is organized around 3 principles: reducing blue spectrum light in the evening hours, increasing morning bright light exposure, and making the transition as consistent and sustainable as possible. Evening light protocol, beginning 2 to 3 hours before sleep. I replaced all overhead LED bulbs in my bedroom, living room, and kitchen with bulbs filtered to emit primarily in the amber-red spectrum above 550 nanometers. These are available as incandescent equivalent bulbs with a color temperature of 1800 to 2200 Kelvin, or a specifically formulated circadian or sleep LED bulbs. The objective is a correlated color temperature well below 3000 Kelvin in all spaces occupied during the evening hours. I applied amber-tinted screen filters to my computer monitor during evening hours, and I use a free software application that automatically shifts the display color temperature to approximately 1900 Kelvin after sunset. On evenings when I use a television, I watch from a distance of at least 2.5 meters and set the screen brightness to its minimum comfortable level. For unavoidable situations requiring standard light, such as cooking or reading detailed material, I use amber-tinted blue light blocking glasses with a lens cut at or below 550 nanometers. Not the mild computer glasses marketed widely for eye strain, but dedicated circadian protection lenses that block the full melanopsin-activating wavelength range. The difference between these and cosmetic blue light glasses is substantial, and the distinction matters for physiological effect. I transition to candlelight, or very low amber lamp illumination, for the final 45 to 60 minutes before sleep. This is not inconvenient in practice. It requires only the placement of 1 or 2 warm light lamp sources and the habit of switching to them at a consistent time each evening. Morning light protocol. Correcting evening light alone is insufficient if morning light exposure is weak or delayed. Robust circadian entrainment requires a strong morning light signal to anchor the SCN's phase. I begin each morning with 15 to 20 minutes of outdoor exposure, or when weather prevents this, 15 minutes in front of a 10,000 lux broad-spectrum light therapy panel within 30 minutes of waking. This morning, bright light exposure reinforces the circadian signal, ensures the cortisol awakening response is appropriately timed, and strengthens the SCN's resistance to phase shifting by evening light. Supplement support, light protocol. I added magnesium glycinate, 300 milliliters taken 60 minutes before sleep. Magnesium is an essential cofactor for over 300 enzymatic reactions, including those involved in vascular smooth muscle relaxation. Research has associated low magnesium status with elevated blood pressure, reduced endothelial function, and dysregulated HPA axis activity. Magnesium glycinate in particular has demonstrated favorable bioavailability compared to oxide forms. I also added a low-dose phosphatidylserine supplement, 100 milligrams with the evening meal, on days of elevated psychological or physical stress. This has been shown in multiple controlled trials to blunt the cortisol awakening response in chronically stressed individuals, and I used it as a targeted buffer during the initial weeks of the protocol when circadian reentrainment was incomplete. I did not add melatonin supplementation. My objective was to restore endogenous melatonin production rather than substitute for it. If melatonin is severely suppressed by years of light-induced disruption, a very low dose, 0.3 to 0.5 milligrams, may help in the initial weeks. My measured results across 11 weeks. Cardiovascular markers. Morning systolic blood pressure, 147 mmHg, down to 1/18. Morning diastolic blood pressure, 94 mmHg, down to 77. Nocturnal mean blood pressure, 131/82, down to 108/67, restoring the normal dipping pattern. Resting heart rate, 74 BPM, down to 63. Heart rate variability, 28 meters, up to 47 me, indicating significant parasympathetic recovery. Reactive hyperemia index, 1.67, up to 2.14. Hormonal markers, salivary cortisol nadir at 2 EUs/AM, 4.2 nanograms per milliliter, down to 1.8 cortisol awakening response, reduced by 22%. Salivary melatonin onset shifted earlier by 63 minutes. Urinary 6-sulfatoxy-melatonin increased by 91%. Subjective improvements, sleep latency, reduced from approximately 35 minutes to 12. Subjective morning energy, substantially improved by week 3. Nocturnal awakening frequency, reduced from 2 or 3 per night to 0 or 1. Morning headache frequency, resolved completely by week 6. The results compounded progressively. The first observable changes, improved sleep latency, and reduced morning headache appeared within the first 2 weeks. The blood pressure improvements became consistently measurable by week 4 and continued to improve through week 11, at which point the trajectory had largely plateaued. Questions I frequently encounter. Can light exposure really produce this magnitude of blood pressure change on its own? A. The magnitude I observed is consistent with, though at the upper end of, what the controlled literature would predict for an individual starting with a substantially disrupted circadian architecture. Individuals who are already strong dippers would be expected to show smaller numerical changes. The effect size is also likely to be larger in older individuals, where the circadian system requires stronger, cleaner signals for robust entrainment. Q. Is this a replacement for blood pressure medication? A. Absolutely not. And I want to be unambiguous on this point. Hypertension is a serious medical condition that in many individuals requires pharmacological management. What the evidence supports, and what I experienced, is that addressing circadian light disruption is a legitimate and mechanistically grounded intervention that can meaningfully reduce blood pressure through pathways independent of medication. It should be discussed with a physician and implemented alongside rather than instead of prescribed treatment. Q. Do amber glasses actually work, or is this placebo? A. The mechanistic and clinical evidence for blue light blocking glasses as a circadian intervention is reasonably robust. A randomized controlled trial demonstrated that amber lens glasses worn for 2 hours before bed significantly increased melatonin levels compared to clear lens controls. The key is that the lens cutoff must be at or below 550 nanometers, the melanopsin sensitivity peak. Glasses marketed as computer glasses with a slight yellow tint offer minimal circadian protection. Q. What about people who need to work in the evening? A. This is the context in which I find the intervention most practically challenging, but also most mechanistically important. Professionals who must do cognitively demanding work in the evening face a genuine trade-off. Blue spectrum light supports alertness in the short term, but this comes at the cost of the circadian disruption described throughout this script. My approach is to maintain amber-filtered ambient lighting and use a monitor filter, accepting a modest reduction in screen color accuracy while reserving full-spectrum overhead lighting only for the earliest part of the evening work period. How long does it take to see results? A. Circadian reentrainment is not instantaneous. The SCN phase shifts at a rate of approximately 1 to 2 hours per day under optimal conditions. Melatonin onset timing required 3 to 4 weeks of consistent protocol adherence to fully normalize in my case. Blood pressure improvements followed the hormonal normalization with a lag of approximately 2 to 3 additional weeks. Sustained consistency in the first 6 weeks appears to be critical. Deviation during this period substantially slows the reentrainment process. Closing summary. The household lighting environment represents a largely unrecognized but mechanistically well-characterized contributor to morning blood pressure elevation and non-dipping hypertension. Blue spectrum LED illumination during the evening hours suppresses melatonin, disrupts the cortisol awakening response amplitude and timing, maintains excessive sympathetic vascular tone, and over time contributes to endothelial dysfunction through increased vascular oxidative stress. The correction does not require pharmaceutical intervention. It requires adjusting the spectral quality of evening household lighting, implementing a consistent morning bright light exposure habit, and, if appropriate, supporting the transition with magnesium glycinate. The protocol is low cost, mechanistically sound, and in my experience produced blood pressure reductions of a magnitude I had not anticipated. I am a cardiovascular physiologist. I measure what I study. The data I collected on my own biology is the most persuasive evidence I have encountered because it confirmed, in precise numerical terms, what the controlled literature had predicted. If you are experiencing elevated morning blood pressure, I would encourage you to monitor your evening light environment with the same scrutiny you give to your sodium intake or medication adherence. The light in your home is not neutral. Its spectrum, timing, and intensity are communicating directly with the systems that govern your cardiovascular health.